Business and Public Policy, welcome. We have a great event today to get a readout on what happened in Dubai. But before we turn to the panel and our moderator, I just wanted to introduce to you the center, for those of you who aren't aware of the center's mission. The Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy is housed at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business. It's a nonpartisan academic research center whose mission is to bring together scholars, policymakers, and business people to discuss, debate, engage in a fact-based conversation about issues that are important to businesses here in the United States and internationally. Okay. Today we are delighted to have a very distinguished panel. I'm not going to introduce the panel, but we'll leave that to the moderator. But our moderator is Carolyn Brandon, who is a senior industry fellow at the Georgetown Center. Her background is in the telecommunications industry. She's an attorney by training, but previously, before joining the center, worked as vice president at CTIA. So we're delighted to have Carolyn with us, and she will now take control. Carolyn, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brad. I am supposed to push a button. Can folks hear me?
No.
I have depressed said button, and it's green. So it should be working, right? Okay. Well, let me know if I'm not speaking loud enough. I'm not sure that the microphones are working. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Carolyn Brandon. I am with the center, and we're just going to quickly go ahead and put the conversation we're about to have in context for you. I'm going to quickly introduce the speakers, and then we're going to go ahead and have a discussion. I think what we'll do is we will save Q&A until the end, unless there is some question you absolutely must ask and can't sort of retain until the end of the conversation. Because we do have some AV issues, if you want to ask a question, we're going to ask you to either stand up and speak very loudly, or perhaps go over to the podium here. Yeah, already. So with that, what we're here to talk about today is what happened or did not happen in Dubai around the WICIT. So the WICIT is the World Conference on International Telecommunications. The ITU hosted the conference in Dubai, which took place over the last 10 or so days. There have been months and months and months of preparation for these conversations. I think we've all seen some of the conversations and issues discussed in both popular press as well as business press. The reason we think at Georgetown this is an important conversation to now bring to the Hill and talk about what did or did not happen is because at heart what is at issue there is what role will international governments have and the US government have in internet governance and internet regulation and how the internet operates. The US, as I'm sure most of you know, has been advocating for quite a long time and certainly did so in Dubai for a multi-stakeholder process, which is essentially the way the US government has been approaching internet regulation here in the US, in which we believe, as the United States, has worked extremely well in terms of fostering opportunities, both economic and otherwise. Various countries around the world disagree with that approach, but that's what we're going to talk about today and hear more about. So without further ado, let me quickly introduce our august panel of speakers, and then we'll go ahead and get the conversation started. We are joined by Michael Wack, counselor to Ambassador Phil Verveer in the Office of U.S., who was with the Office of U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy. David Gross, who is partner at Wiley, Rein and former U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy at the State Department. Jonathan McHale, Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for Telecom and Electronic Commerce Policy, Office of the U.S. Trade Rep. Jacquelynn Ruff, Vice President, International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Verizon. And last but certainly not least, Amy Alvarez, Executive Director, International, External, and Regulatory Affairs for AT&T. The reason why these particular folks are joining us today to have this conversation is because they are all part of the U.S. informal delegation that was sent over to Dubai and engaged in these conversations. So they are coming back, I think, largely having returned from Dubai this weekend, fresh off the plane, as it were, to share their thoughts. So with that as background, let me turn, Michael, to you, and we'll just literally go down the panel, if you don't mind. Can you share some thoughts about what did or did not happen in Dubai?
Sure, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. I'm here on behalf of Phil Verveer, who was the original invitee. Phil is a Georgetown graduate, loves all things Georgetown. Told me not to come down and make a fool of myself, so I do the best I can in that regard. Also, here we're sitting in the Rayburn building. I wanted to give a quick nod of thanks and appreciation to the leadership of the Energy and Commerce Committee and all the other members of Congress who issued statements at the end of the conference that were, I thought, welcoming and positive, and the delegation really appreciated that. It's very important for people who have election certificates on their walls to be the ones who are helping to guide this process in major part as we go forward. As you look back on the wicket, for Phil Verveer, you say that the United States enters all treaty conferences with one overarching goal, which is to advance the broad national interest. Phil thinks that we have accomplished that in two important respects in Dubai. In respect number one, we've advanced an important dialogue about the internet. The United States, excuse me, and many other participants never wavered from our adherence and support for the multi-stakeholder governance model, which is a pillar of the internet's success. We did that because the facts on the ground tell a very compelling story. Underneath that model, we have achieved this wonderful internet. No one in Dubai showed us that it was broken in any respect, so let's not fix it. There is a multi-stakeholder process in which governments can participate, and they are welcome to participate in that process. And the United States very much hopes that they do, because we feel that government participation will enrich that process. But make no mistake, our allegiance to that model of governance is unwavering. The second important public interest that we advanced was that we furthered a dialogue about how important it is to have broadband deployment facilitated in the developing world and all around the world. We're very pleased that that subject, which was really the original purpose and intent of the conference, that our commitment to that was shared by so many nations. We will continue that dialogue. We will continue to engage in multinational forums on that dialogue at the ITU and elsewhere, beginning with the Broadband Commission, ITU Broadband Commission meeting early next year in Mexico. At the end of the day, the authoritarian-leaning nations of the ITU derailed the conference. Excuse me. And that's unfortunate, because during the course of the conference, working with these folks, with many nations around the world, we very much improved the original document that was on the table. And at the end, the document, the output document that was signed, is forward-looking in many important respects. It includes provisions promoting market liberalization, favoring commercially negotiated agreements over regulation, advancing consumer protections and the rights of the disabled, and preventing the internet and the telecom sectors from being burdened by discredited tax and transfer schemes. At the end of the day, there were too many flaws in the document to make it signable. We don't apologize for that, and that decision does not leave us isolated. Fewer than half of the ITU membership actually signed the document. And now there are 54 nations that have joined with the United States in either declining to sign it as a matter of course, or they've gone back for consultations. We feel like many people, many of those countries will come back and join us and refuse to sign. Importantly, many of those who did not sign were not the U.S., just the U.S. and Canada and Europe, but we had signatories like Costa Rica, Colombia, India, Japan, Kenya, the Philippines. And so very strong leadership from non-Western parts of the world, and that's important. The bottom line is the results of Wicket 12 are not cause for the United States to withdraw from the global conversation about these issues, but to engage on a going forward basis. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Jonathan, we may or may not have microphone capability.
We do. This works. Good. Okay, first a correction. I was not in Dubai, and I do want to first commend the U.S. team for what sounds like an extraordinary accomplishment in what they managed to do at that conference. my interest at USTR is ensuring to some extent that these ITU rules that are put in place don't conflict with what we're trying to do on the trade front. And I think the result is actually quite favorable in that output. Our main interest, of course, is in liberalization, to a large extent getting the government out of the way so that the commercial entities can have commercial negotiations and the market access that enables them to bring services to both consumers and to the businesses that rely on these networks. The one area that was of most concern to the stakeholders that we were engaged with beforehand was what many folks have heard about, the Aetna proposal for essentially bringing in the sort of a circuit switch construct for how you handle exchange of traffic and monetary exchanges between carriers into the internet world. And there was a lot of focus on, can't we make sure that from a trade perspective that doesn't impede some of our trade interests, and that certainly was a threat. Certainly in the lead up to this conference, I think we can safely say that has been put off the table, and I think that that is again one of the major accomplishments. I think what was very interesting from my perspective was, ITU and WTO are sort of to some extent rival organizations. The ITU representing governments, representing often ex-monopoly carriers, putting in place structures with a lot of good goals of ensuring interconnectivity, ensuring some degree of transparency, but often ending up as an instrument essentially for, in many cases, raising rates, in many cases embedding monopolists in the market, whereas we, starting with the WTO, are really trying to get the companies and competition to be the main source of ensuring connectivity, ensuring lower rates rather than from a top-down perspective. And the Aetna proposal, looking back at what I think was going on, was again, it seems, an effort of forming a monopolist, seeing a revenue stream declining, trying to use an international institution to again rejigger the negotiating or the commercial balance to see if they could extract more of the revenue out of from the transactions. And what was really interesting is in the past, that as most of the traffic from the U.S. was going to the developing country, we were always at to some extent, tactical disadvantage because we had to get traffic into these countries, and they could demand high rates for the privilege of having the traffic going in. What I have found fascinating is once on the internet and broadband development, it's sort of the tables have turned, and that you have the broadband in these markets. Everybody wants it. You've got consumers that want the access to the internet. And it's more consumers pulling rather than calls going into countries that are the dynamic. And I think to some extent that's why this proposal really never really made sense, because essentially it would be the carriers saying, I am essentially going to deprive my consumers from what they want, as opposed to in the old days when it was us calling in, the leverage was in the opposite direction. So again, great accomplishment putting that issue off the table. Just quickly, just to highlight how there's some of the intersections between what's going on in trade and what will continue. Issues like roaming, that is coming into the trade forum. We are looking to see how you can have ways of ensuring that there are alternatives to roaming, and that roaming isn't an impediment. Spam is not something that I understand why the ITU would be focused on, but you see that as an issue that's in the new regulations. But we are also dealing with that in the trade context. There's a lot of these same issues that are appearing. We are seeing attempts to have trade rules try and provide a framework for addressing some of the internet charging arrangements. The long issue that went back to APEC. We think it's an unfortunate idea, and we certainly don't subscribe to that. But you do see that appearing in part of what came out of some of the resolutions from this result. But long story short, some of these same issues you're seeing in the ITU are also migrating into some of the trade agreements we're trying to negotiate, and some of the same outcomes, I think, are what we're trying to develop as good policy. Not having governments necessarily trying to tip the balance in favor of a competitive outcome, and allowing a lot of the, we don't focus so much on multi-stakeholder, but there's a big push in the trade rules to have a transparent and ability of everybody to participate in rulemaking, so that you have good outcomes that aren't simply dictated from the top down. I'll leave it there. Happy to take questions. One final point. I did also notice that we have seen one aspect that the IT rules do address, which is the taxation issue. Governments, again, looking for revenue and trying to use telecommunication traffic as a revenue source, which the ITU helpfully has said you probably should not do. You should probably not try and tax the incoming calls, focus on taxation on the internal side. But I'll leave it at that and let people who are actually on the ground in Dubai, who probably have more interesting things to say, continue. Thanks.
Hi, I'm David Gross, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to join you all. On my way up here, I was thinking, what am I going to talk about? Because the details are really sort of at times mind-numbing, and probably you all know a fair number of them. But coming up to Capitol Hill, it dawned on me that probably the thing that you might be most interested in is some of the politics about what was going on. So let me just touch on that, but also let you know that if you want to talk mind-numbingly about the details of this, I'm always here for you. I love that stuff. So let me talk about the politics before, during, and in the future. Domestically, the politics were quite remarkable. That is, because of the concern about the effect of international regulation of the internet, there was an extraordinary unity within the United States that was probably best expressed by the congressional resolutions on the House side, on the Senate side, and then ultimately by having a joint resolution. And I know some of the people who are very actively involved in that are here with us today, and I want to thank them very much. We did something similar to this during the World Summit back in 2003 and 2005. It was done again. And for those of you who wonder whether or not those sort of expressions of unanimity domestically translate internationally, let me tell you in no uncertain terms the answer is yes. People look very carefully at what's happening here on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in the United States for an indication of what's going on and what they should do internationally. The fact that there was one voice at times bewildered the rest of the world, who knows all too well about our conflicts politically in the United States, and yet ultimately was something of extraordinary importance. To fast forward, after the whole thing was done, after the signing, I saw the chairman of the conference, Mohammed Al-Gayin, who's an old friend of mine, who is the head of the regulatory agency in the UAE, which was our host. And when we had a long chat, because I've known him for many years, and this was a very difficult process for him. And he put together, at the end of the day, what in essence was a very good document for us. There are obviously some very important points, as Michael pointed out, that made it impossible for us to sign. And he knew that, and he came to me and gave me a hug and said, I know how difficult it was for the US, I know how difficult it was for us, and I know the reason why you couldn't sign it was because of your Congress. The Congress had in fact expressed the view of the United States with a singular voice. And that voice was to ensure that we would not have international, intergovernmental control of the internet. So that was known all the way through and played a critical role in the outcome of this negotiations. Let me also talk a little bit at the conference. It was fascinating to watch the politics. Not only the usual politics, of which we are all very familiar, but let me tell you some of the good news politics. The US and Europe were extraordinarily aligned. I've been doing this for many years. I had the honor of leading the US delegations to these types of conferences for 8 years. It's always a complicated relationship between the United States and Europe in these areas. Often we start in alignment and somehow go off of alignment. The alignment lasted all the way through. Europe was extraordinarily unified. It was unified in ways that were a reflection of the politics of Europe today, which was similar to some of the politics here in the United States in terms of actions taken by the European Parliament, by the European Commission, and the like. And so up until basically the very, very end, Europe spoke not with one voice, but with many voices all saying basically the same thing. So one of the lessons I took away is that, in fact, these internet-related issues are ones that bring the United States and Europe together in ways that I think are extraordinarily productive. China was, as you would expect, very focused on other issues and did not share our approach to the importance of a multi-stakeholder governance system for the internet. But ultimately, China, it was singularly focused primarily on security-related issues. And there is a security provision in this agreement, not what China sought, but something that I think found wide acceptance because it focused not on internet security, but on telecommunications network security-related issues. Africa was very united, also in ways that often were not in accord with what the US and Europe was looking for. And I think one of the things that's important as we look forward, which I'll touch on in a moment, is that these issues will not go away, and the views of Africa and the developing world are strong and getting stronger. They continue to not subscribe, by and large, to the wisdom of a multi-stakeholder approach, but rather, particularly in a forum like the ITU, where governments speak for countries, that in fact they continue to believe that governments and intergovernmental organizations should have primacy over these issues. I would say that Africa was not completely united. Kenya, for example, a country that has invested both in terms of economically and socially and politically very much in internet, had a very different view and was very powerful down the stretch in expressing a view that actually was very much aligned with the progressive views of the United States, Europe, and others. For me, the Middle East, particularly since we were in the Middle East, was fascinating. You could feel the breeze of the Arab Spring as we were in those meetings. In the past, the Arab states were very unified in previous ITU meetings, showing basically a unity of views and purpose. Even though this meeting was being held in the UAE, an excellent host, I will quickly add, to our meeting, nevertheless, the Arab states were not unified. Saudi and the UAE, Egypt on occasion, and others took a very conservative approach. Conservative in the sense of the view being that governments ought to be in control, that the internet was something to protect people from and need to be managed in a way that governments traditionally manage. Other countries in the region did not take that view and express so on the microphone, something that is somewhat unusual. The Americas, I would say, was a mixed bag. CETEL, an area which for the Americas is something that's near and dear to my heart and to many people's hearts here. But there was a wide variety of views expressed on the microphone during the conference from the Americas. Canada and the United States and Mexico largely, but not always, particularly towards the end, had one set of views. Brazil had another set of views, together with Argentina and others. Colombia ultimately expressed views very similar to the United States. And so we had a great variety in our hemisphere of perspectives. And Central America, as noted before, also, I think, had a variety of views that was very interesting and very telling for us going forward. Ultimately, as is often the case, not often, sometimes the case in these international meetings, politically we were saved by Iran. That seems counterintuitive, I know. But as I mentioned before, the chairman of the conference did an excellent job in putting a document together that was broadly acceptable by virtually all of the countries of the world, with certain exceptions, including the United States, the UK, Canada, perhaps a few others. And frankly, this was going to be a potential political problem. And I will give great credit to the leadership of the US delegation, of which I quickly note I was not a leader of the US delegation, so I can credit them freely. Phil Verveer, Terry Kramer, Larry Strickland, when it was there for almost the entire time, and other senior government leaders, did a terrific job of articulating our views, the importance of those views, and the like. But at the last minute, as this document was put together that was actually, as was noted by Michael, a very good document with some things that were poison pills from our perspective, having to do with internet-related issues and the like. Iran took the floor and demanded a vote on what they called a human rights provision. And that human rights provision, there was already one in there at the request of the Secretary General, but this one actually was a strange one that was reflective of the views of many African countries, in which it expressed the view that member states should have a human right and a right to access international telecommunications networks. Now that may seem unexceptional, but for those of you who do human rights law, you would immediately realize that this really was an extraordinary request. Human rights, by their very nature, go to the individual, not to governments. And this was a request that governments have, in essence, a human right. And so, when Iran called for a vote, and we received a vote, and the vote succeeded, they got this language into the system, into the document. And during the interregnum between when that happened and the signing ceremony, something in the order of probably, roughly, 50 other countries realized that they could not sign. They could not sign because they could not agree to a new human right that did not otherwise exist in human rights law, and in fact was an anathema for those who do care about human rights laws. That is the power of the individual. And so thanks to Iran, we were not isolated with just our few normal allies, but in fact had a very large coalition. And let me add quickly, let me make it clear that of those 50, 55 eventually, I don't want to suggest that in fact that they were in fact happy with the internet-related language and so forth. Rather, for all countries, when you have to make these decisions, you have to make a balancing decision about these types of documents. Clearly, the Iranian proposal shifted the balance the other way. But as you listen to the other statements by those 55, virtually all of them were deeply troubled by the internet provisions that we found to be an anathema. And so going forward, and we can talk more in a moment about going forward, these issues will be front and center. Takeaways for me is that most of the governments of the world are not convinced of what we think is the right way to go in terms of multi-stakeholder. There is much work to be done by governments, by industry, by civil society and others to work on those issues. We have many upcoming international events, including treaty writing events next year at the ITU. Next year will be 2014. I'm already in 2013. I hope you all have done your holiday shopping too. We have a lot of work and very difficult work. So the great coalitions that came together need to stay together. The politics of the Hill need to stay unified because they are not, those messages are not lost on those outside of our borders. Thanks.
Good afternoon, it's great to be here, and I must say it's always a challenge following David Gross on a panel. I had the opportunity to be in Dubai for an entire month. I attended the ITU's World Telecom Standardization Assembly, where some of the issues from a technical aspect were discussed and debated, and then stayed on for Wicket. So it is good to be back in DC and to talk about all that happened over the course of the past month. In terms of what didn't happen, and David alluded to this, one of the preoccupations of the Arab states, Africa, and Russia was to include a new definition for telecommunications / ICT and international telecom services / ICT into the revised treaty. And as you can imagine, this would open up very wide the scope of the type of services and networks that would be swept under the ITRs, processing, all kinds of computer activities. So that was a major concern for us and others. However, when the chair of the conference presented his compromise package text to the plenary, the definitions for telecom and international telecom services remained the same. I think this will continue to be an issue. In fact, the ITU right now has a working group where they are putting together ideas, drafts in terms of what a definition of telecom / ICT could be. And as David mentioned, we do have another ITU treaty conference in 2014. It's the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference, where these definitions will be looked at, possibly revised, and indeed there is a desire to make these changes that would be profoundly impacting on the internet. And as Jonathan said, there were exclusion of ethno-like charging arrangements in the treaty itself, and there is a resolution that basically punts work on general compensation issues into ITU-T Study Group 3. So again, this will be an issue that will continue to live, and there was significant interest in the Arab states and from some of the African countries to ensure that these issues were somehow dealt with by WICIT, if not in the treaty itself, in this resolution. An important thing that didn't happen was the Arab states also had a proposal that would basically allow member states to get information from providers on IP traffic routes and possibly prohibit certain traffic routing arrangements. This was of significant concern. Basically, it just goes against the whole technology of IP routing, and in addition would cause significant financial, human resource burdens on operators and member states themselves. The FCC was great on the microphone in trying to make these points, and ultimately we were successful in getting those type of very restrictive provisions from being included. And one other thing I thought that was interesting was not included was the United States had proposed a modification to an existing resolution contained in the ITRs. It was a resolution on the changing telecommunications environment, and the United States sought to include concepts such as competition, liberalization, transparency, and private investment within that resolution to encourage member states to take these concepts on in terms of their regulatory regimes and frameworks. What was interesting about this was that this proposal was pretty much dismissed out of hand because many member states, many Arab states in fact, thought that such ideas could impact the sovereign right of a nation to regulate their telecommunications market as they see fit. So I found that quite interesting, and then comparing that to this internet resolution that was pushed through, there was a very different treatment of resolutions. So those were my key takeaways. It was quite a time, and for those who missed WICIT 12, there's also a resolution that was pushed by Ghana to have the plenipotentiary take a look and see if there should be a more frequent revision to the ITRs. So Plenipot 2014 will consider this resolution, and there is some recommendation that the review could take place every 8 years. So more to come. Thank you.
Great. Well, trying to figure out what I can add here that hasn't been said, but I suppose it might be also just useful to reinforce a couple points from the perspective of, like AT&T, Verizon is a very large, or let's say very active provider of global services. So primarily outside the US, we're doing enterprise services, but they include a very innovative IP-based cloud services. We have a large part of the global backbone, both of our companies do, and that's on IP network. So when we think of internet, we're thinking of it to include IP interconnection, on which there were proposals coming in, IP networks, IP services. So that is the perspective that we brought. And in that context, I think the objectives were clearly achieved in terms of holding off major intergovernmental intrusion into that space. I do agree that the bipartisan congressional action was very important in making clear the perspective of the U.S. going into it, and we had unanimity across a very broad coalition of different U.S. government agencies, different types of industry, and then civil society, as we would refer to it in that context, consumer organizations, different public interest organizations, so that was quite helpful. And I agree, of course, that the dialogue was very important and that we needed to, and we did, I hope, hear the kinds of ideas and concerns that were being raised, particularly by emerging countries. And I don't think that the actual numbers tell the full story of what different countries are thinking about. So when it came to voting on the treaty, as has been said, there were many ways in which it was a kind of moderate treaty. It had some difficult parts, but much of it was good. And from countries' perspective that may not be really involved in the multi-stakeholder discussions on internet or, that sort of thing, it may have seemed fine in certain ways. And I think if we had a conversation about what do we really want, you want more broadband deployment, you do want the ability to you want to figure out what the forward-looking policies are domestically. Those kinds of things, we'd probably have a much more even or even more people closer to our position than you would see in a UN meeting voting on things where it's a kind of a take it or leave it package. So I believe that, yes, there's much more work to be done. I'm not disagreeing with David's takeaway as to what the view is on a policy framework, but neither do I feel pessimistic about the ability to move in a more positive direction that will be expressed in different ways if we really put our minds to it. And I think that will involve two types of things. One is to continue the strategy which you see embodied here, which is work on multi-stakeholder organizations and so on, strengthen those, work on trade, because that's all about creating the ability to have cross-border data flows and commerce and so on. And in the ITU, continue to work with it and just have an honest dialogue that brings, within these study groups, within the standard setting process and so on, tries to make those outcomes be as pro-growth, pro-innovation, pro-investment as we can. Really work hard on that. So those three prongs. So I would say going forward, my notes here I had was redouble the efforts in all of these areas, emphasize a development agenda in every way that's possible, which means at the State Department, at USAID, maybe at the multilateral banks, and those of you who are thinking about funding sometimes in the budgets from the congressional perspective, keep an eye out for that. Accelerate the deployment of mobile broadband. I really think that's what we will see, and it would be interesting to have had this meeting three years hence or 5 years hence when there would actually be more mobile broadband already in many of the emerging economies that were so active here. Maybe they would have been more open-minded because they wouldn't feel like they needed to focus so much on getting the revenues to do that, and some I think non-productive ideas on how to do that. And then, as has been said before, address the concerns, look at some of these specific issues, share best practices, share experiences on things like spam, even security issues, the deployment of broadband. And we have a great institution here in Washington, the U.S. Telecom Training Institute, which does get some federal funding and USAID money and so on. And what it does is work with regulators and private sector participants from emerging economies, particularly in Africa. And we had a lot of good dialogues, I think, with people who had come through that program. And I am personally, we're on the board of it, as is AT&T. I'm personally highly motivated to do even more of that, because I think that sort of thing, sort of a people-to-people, government-to-government, industry-to-industry initiative is really what we just have to do even more of to work off of this and try to move things constantly in a better and better direction.
Jackie, can I ask you a quick question? For those for folks in the audience that might at a 100,000 foot level understand why a company like Verizon would want to be at the table for these kinds of conversations. And I guess this question also is posed to you, Amy. Could you just sort of make it a little more clear, why is it that Verizon is at this table, and why is it important for some of these issues that have been identified by the speakers to be resolved in certain ways, from a, what you do for a living and how the company is operating?
Sure. Well, as I said at the outset, we are a global player from a business perspective. So a backbone, connectivity into countries. If you think about cloud services, in order for those to flourish, you need to be able to have good connectivity going in. You need to have the data flow back and forth across borders. It's very interesting to see studies, by the way, that say that cloud services are of highest interest often in emerging economies, because you sort of get the greatest value where you can just pull something off of the cloud rather than having to do hardware, infrastructure, et cetera. So there's a kind of an amplifier effect. Okay, so this treaty, to some extent, even the existing 1988 version, and certainly the version going forward, tries to look at what are the terms for doing interconnection, traffic exchange, and so on. There were proposals going in that would have heavily constrained some of those voluntary commercial types of arrangements, and required certain business models, required the institution of sort of international access charges on internet services. And the routing, disclosure, and control information, you can imagine somebody said, oh, you can have cloud services, but you only can take one route for internet-based services, and you have to pay a fee, and et cetera, et cetera. It would really eviscerate the whole way of doing that. So, and another issue, as Jonathan mentioned, was roaming rate regulation. I think in all of those cases, we came to outcomes that were very much moderated by the end of the conference. So there are hortatory provisions you'll see, there are things to be studied, there are should, encourage, to, promote, that kind of language, which is fine. I think we can all live with that. But we also will need to work on these issues to try to get the policy outcomes going forward to be equally flexible.
Amy, did you want to add anything?
I would just add quickly that from an entity that's covered by the existing ITRs and will be covered by the future ITRs, one of the motivations for us to participate and be at the table is because there was a real concern that in dealing with issues like security or spam, the obligations would be placed on network operators only. And although we don't want to expand the scope of the ITU or ITRs to cover application providers, software developers, and the like, there was a real risk that any such provision could focus solely on what network operators would be obligated to do. And we do it, but addressing these important issues require the participation of all players in the internet ecosystem. So that was one of the motivating factors for us, as well as issues like roaming, where it was quite possible that there could be extremely prescriptive rate regulation placed on operators.
David, if I may, you shared your thoughts and insights in terms of the politics, both before, during, and after. Can you give us some insights into the politics of the actual U.S. delegations? Not, politics as defined here in the Beltway, but, at first blush, it seemed like a very large delegation, and it seemed to be representative of a huge diversity of stakeholders that have talked about these various issues here in the U.S. that all seem to be on the same page. Is there more you can offer? Any more insights?
I'll make something up. It was an extraordinarily large delegation. It was, I think, ultimately something in the order of about 130, something like that. You have to always be a little careful because we had people sort of flowing through the delegation. I'm not sure if technically they were all members or not, but they were all treated as if they were members, and that was very good. Yeah, I think that was a reflection of the extraordinary importance of the subject matter across industry lines, across civil society, academia, and others. That it was worth not only their time and energy to be interested in the subject, but also the cost of attending. You know, this is Dubai. This is not, you know, just up the road on 95. It was 2 weeks, and a substantial number of those people came and stayed for the 2 weeks. And as Amy pointed out, there was a very important ITU conference just before, for the 2 weeks before, having to do with standards issues. So actually a large number of our delegation, including some of our senior leadership team, Dick Beard and others, were there for an entire month. And as exciting as Dubai is, I think a month in Dubai is probably not what they're looking to do every year of their life. The dynamics were very interesting, largely because you would expect it to be a much more politically and socially complicated mix. We have people on that delegation that basically agree on virtually nothing, except for the subject. And so I would say one of the things that's really extraordinarily interesting is how welcoming that commonality is across these groups. The ability to get together, to find common cause, to find expressions of ways of thinking about the future and how they can work together going forward is, I think, maybe one of the lasting legacies for this. You know, one of the issues that you always have with these major meetings is there's great energy, anxiety, and the like before and during, and then you have what's sort of a little bit of a postpartum depression afterwards of, well, what are you doing next? There is none of that here, at least none that I've been able to see. That is the sense that not only do we continue to face many of the same challenges that we had before, maybe even it's clear what those challenges are, but also the great opportunities of working together and the power that comes from working across geopolitically, as I mentioned, Europe and the United States as one example, other governments as well, some of which were surprising, but also within the delegation of having this great variety of interests. When you have companies like Facebook, Google, Verizon, AT&T, Cisco, academia, public knowledge, CDT, it gives you some sense of the breadth of the interest. Microsoft was very much a presence there. So you can appreciate that, and I think Michael could talk about across the U.S. government, the number of leaders, DOD, State Department, FCC, really quite an extraordinary collection.
And in fact, Michael, I was going to ask you if you could actually address that, as well as share any thoughts you have about, are there larger, bigger picture spillover effects? To your point in your initial comments, the United States was not isolated and was not alone in terms of some of the concerns that the country had. Are there positive implications going forward with some of our, with some of the other folks, other countries at the table there beyond just telecom, do you think?
Well, first I want to just associate myself with David's remarks about the delegation. It's really nice to be on a team that's that big and you've spent your whole career in one group or another, and then everybody comes together and works very hard. I know in particular Amy was in this thing from the very beginning with AT&T, going back more than a year ago when we started to have meetings over at the State Department, the Council Working Group process. It's a real small group, and then gradually over time that group becomes larger. I did want to just point out one of the dynamics that I was very pleased with and remarkable to see was we had a lot of internet companies, pure internet companies, PayPal, GoDaddy, Hurricane Electric, Martin Levy of Hurricane Electric, what you might think of as pure multi-stakeholder groups unfamiliar with the government. And they came in and added a lot of value to the delegation. And I also think that they were surprised to find that when you get over into these international forums, people from Ghana and Uganda, and they have a difficulty initially making contact, but then they gradually started to figure out how to put their points across in a language that the ITU people could understand. So there was a commonality and a joining that occurred in Dubai, and I think that may ultimately be, going forward, one of the most important outcomes of the conference, because we do need to make the multi-stakeholder governance process more welcoming to people who are now on the outside throwing rocks at it. And it can be done. A lot of that is really a cultural difference that we need to work on. And then going forward, again, as I mentioned in my original remarks, it's engage, engage, engage. Keep the dialogue up. The United States has tremendous advantages in this space. We have the best companies, the best technologies. We have a lot of experience with making things work. And when you get over to Dubai and these international conferences, and you talk to people, the people in Ghana, they perceive they have a spam problem. So they want the ITU to solve it, when in fact, you could sit down with Martin Levy of Hurricane Electric, and I think Amy or somebody from AT&T was in this meeting. We set up meetings with members of our Dell and individual delegations from around the world to say, here's the technical solution, and we can cure this problem in 2 weeks. You want to wait for the ITU to work it for 5 years, or would you rather have your spam problem solved in 2 weeks? And so eyes lit up, and ultimately, Ghana stayed with Hamadan and voted for the treaty. But we're going to follow up behind the scenes. A lot of that activity has already started. Follow up, reaching out to individual countries, by the U.S. community, the U.S. technical community. And I think, again, that's going to be the most lasting positive impact of the conference.
So really quick, can someone remind me how much more time do we have for our gathering today? Are we going till 1 or 1:15? Okay, perfect. Right, so one question, and I think any one of you on the panel could probably address it, and that is just for the audience. Can you walk us through very specifically what are the next opportunities where some of these, we'll call them the unresolved issues, are going to continue to be discussed and debated? I know there was reference to convening in Mexico, separately the convening in 2014. Is there just a short list that folks can walk us through so that we have a sense of what the process will be going forward? David, Amy?
I'll start, but tell me the month you want to have a meeting, and I can tell you where the meeting is. So there's no lack of that. It is the international norm, I would say. But in terms of sort of the big ones coming up, where these issues really get joined, decisions may be made, there are a couple of notable ones. I mentioned earlier there was a UN Heads of State Summit called the World Summit on the Information Society that was held in 2003 and 2005. As is typical for the UN, they never want to leave a good thing alone. So therefore, what they do is every 10 years after the end of one of these things, they revisit it to see what ought to be done, what progress has been made, what changes need to be addressed. And so there will be a WSIS plus 10, as they like to call it, in 2015. I mention that first because there are meetings leading up to that, including a meeting in February that UNESCO has. The ITU will host a meeting in Geneva in May. In May also, at the same week, fortunately, the ITU will be hosting a very important conference called the World Telecommunications Policy Forum. They have these policy forums now for many years, every few years to address an issue. This particular policy forum is basically singularly focused on internet-related issues, very directly. So it's none of this pretending like it's about telecom and then moving into the internet. It's all about the internet. Now there is no output in terms of the decisions that are made, but there are opinions and recommendations that come out of it that then flow into the ITU Plenipotentiary, which is that treaty writing conference I referred to earlier. Others did as well, which will be an extraordinarily important event. That'll take place for about 3 weeks in Busan, Korea, in November, if I remember correctly, of 2014. Let me also note that that will be important not only because it'll be a meeting where many of the issues we were just talking about will be front and center once again, in fact in a more expansive way, but also the leadership of the ITU has 5 elected officials. 2 of those elected officials, the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General, are term limited. That is, their term will be up. One other official is as well. That means that the senior-most elected officials will be turning over after 2014. And who is elected, and the election is done by governments of the world, will be critically important in determining the nature of the ITU, what the ITU will be focused on, what its views will be collectively as an entity as compared to being just a recipient of views of member states going forward. And so over the next, actually it'll be starting very, very soon. There'll be announcements about who will be running, and that election will be extraordinarily important. So those are some. There was mention about there's a broadband, an ITU UNESCO broadband commission that meets regularly to discuss these, that are itself somewhat multi-stakeholder. That is, it has leaders from industry, academia, governments, and others. That is done, although technically under the auspices of both the UNESCO and the ITU, is really a creature of the ITU as a practical matter. There will be many things coming out of that as well, but that would be a few, but I'm sure others have comments as well.
Jonathan, we don't want to leave you untouched with follow-on questions. With respect to 2013, 2014, do you see any upcoming trade agreements or negotiations or conversations where you feel some of the issues that you identified that were touched upon in Dubai will be front and center?
Well, we've got two main fora that we're focused on right now. One is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's an active negotiation. We're also looking to potentially do a negotiation called the International Services Agreement. That's not yet, no yet decision on those. In both of those, you do have telecom rules that we make as part of the agreement. I think what we're working now on the TPP is sort of, to some extent, the old frameworks, looking at the circuit switch world. As time goes on, and certainly as the ITU conference makes clear, that's less and less relevant for the companies that are the main constituents that we're trying to help in business. So I think going forward, we are going to try and figure out, what is relevant in a trade context for folks that are really not in this old circuit switched world where some of the controls and rate regulation are the main focus, but the other opportunities for people using the internet, so VoIP, data flows, where you put your servers and so forth, are very relevant and are to some extent, I think, reflected in our view that a lot of this institutions to control all those aspects are less important, and you really want to give more flexibility to commercial solutions to set the architecture for the way these networks evolve.
So I think we can pause and ask the audience if anyone has any questions they would like to pose to any of the speakers. Yes, and you have your choice. Stand up, talk loudly, or traipse across the room and use a microphone. Your call, but if you could identify yourself, please.
I'm Dan Brenner with Hogan Lovell, and great presentation. I'm just wondering, when I'm listening to this from people who are very close to it, I almost get the feeling that the real issue here was that this conference was the first time that the ITU was faced very directly with a question saying, this isn't really any of your business. In other words, that a large number of thoughtful people just don't see this as an area where the ITU should step in. And so when you have a jurisdictional fight as opposed to substantive terms fights, other kinds of forces in the room apply. You're talking to people who make a living going to these meetings, and you're telling them, thanks, but you're welcome to come to meetings, but really you're not supposed to do anything here. I think that came out in a dynamic. So it would be perfectly natural for Iran to throw a mud ball in the punch, because as far as they're concerned, these processes, they believe in this process, whether it affects the internet or not. I'm just wondering then, to what extent are the dynamics of the ITU, and people have criticized, the ITU as being a kind of in a search for a role in the internet age. It's almost like an identity crisis, and you were asked to try to negotiate a treaty about something which is, the substance of which is secondary to really whether this is the right place to talk about.
Dan, was there a question in that?
Actually, I think there was a question there. My friend Dan Brenner, I'll take that on. I think there has been a tendency, and it's unhelpful, to kind of trivialize some of these issues and make them more into ad hominem disagreements. You know, the ITU is a regulatory body, and they want to continue their existence, and regulatory bodies seek to expand their jurisdiction, yak, yak, blah, blah. That's all true from a certain extent. There's far too much emphasis has been placed on that. Hamadan Toure is a nice person. His kids live in the U.S. He was extraordinarily gracious to the United States in the ramp up to this conference, at the conference, as was the chairman, Mr. Alvarez. And so I think we're all well advised to keep this at a much higher level, 50,000 feet. We have real differences about internet governance. They have nothing to do with personalities involved. And one of the great challenges moving forward is to make sure that the debate stays principled and high level, because it's very easy for it to kind of fall apart in a way that would be most unhelpful.
Could I just add?
Please, go ahead.
I also think that sort of taking that to another step, it's a global debate and discussion about what internet policy should be. And we have certain frameworks for that. We had OECD principles last year, so 5 or 6 pages of how to think about that. We've got a shorter list of principles that are being used in trade agreements. If we had a conversation with some of the countries that were there and we're talking with their policymakers, and we had the regulator, but also those that are in charge of economic development and broadband and so on, I think we could have a very interesting discussion that would say, here's kind of the rule of law that one would use, and it's more about consumer protection, competition law, it's less about prescriptive rules, and we might find some common ground. And so that, to me, is the challenge. How do we have that global conversation over the next period? And what is the role of the multi-stakeholder organizations then in sort of embodying this other framework and this other way of looking at things? So, we've got to figure out how to do that even better. We've got a lot that's been done. We have to figure out how to do that, even more of that.
Any other questions? Yes.
It seems to me that in the few days since the wicket ended, there's been kind of a messaging problem in that the conversation I'm hearing this afternoon from all of you is that there was a lot of good that came out of this conference. There were a lot of positive and affirmative results, but that the United States could not sign on because of the poison pills, if you will, of the internet governance issue. Yet, the media over the last few days has seemed to be of two kinds. One of statements from U.S. government officials that seem to be quite a bit more negative about the result, and then on the other hand, saw the New York Times essay or article, which was, what the heck is the United States doing, not signing on to this? We got everything we wanted. Going forward, and in terms of avoiding negative blowback from the countries and the officials that we all need to work with in the ITU and in the international community, how do you think that you folks in the State Department, USTR, NTIA, and elsewhere can improve that messaging so that there are not negative reactions where some think that Hamadan Toure or Mr. Al-Ghanim has been trashed, and that's clearly not what any of you are saying here today.
I'm not much in the messaging business, and you see the stories. And it's kind of like politics, like it's a basketball game, like there's winners and losers and things like that. It's not a basketball game. And I think there's a natural tendency after something like this in the first couple of days where people kind of report on their emotions. But, you know, it's Wednesday today, right? And so, so all that is behind us. It really doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is on a going forward basis, what do we do next? It is what it is. We are where we are. How do we improve the national interest going forward? It's not personality driven. There'll be a change in leadership. As many of you know, Mr. Verveer is leaving the State Department, as am I, along with Phil. And so we'll have new leadership there. There's a lot of rumors about changing chairs around at the FCC and NTIA. I don't really think it matters. There is to some degree, there is a team. There is a U.S. government team that is represented by institutions, the Department of Defense, DISA, DHS, State, NTIA, the FCC. I know I'm forgetting somebody there. I'm probably forgetting a lot of them. But, and the institutions are what are being represented. And the people that are, the individuals, that'll change over time. But the most important thing is that there's a broad consensus, and I think there is a broad consensus, as you see from those Hill resolutions. That last one, right before we went over, 397 to nothing. I love that kind of guidance. A lot of clarity of thought. We work together. We'll distill those thoughts, plan, get ready, take advantage of our opportunities beginning in Mexico in March, I think, with the Broadband Commission meeting, and then WTPF in May. And I don't think it's a messaging thing. It's more, let's keep our eye on the substance and move forward.
Jim, if it meant one thing, rise to the defense of those who are government officials here, since I'm not one. There was an unprecedented amount of press guidance and interest in this. There was a whole team in Dubai associated with the delegation that was singularly focused on providing the public, including the press, of course, with information on an ongoing basis. I don't remember the last time we had so many people dedicated to doing that, both here, both in Dubai and elsewhere. We're all experienced enough to realize that the press does not always see things without controversy. I would say that the amount of public statements coming out by U.S. government officials have been very good. Let me just state one thing, just because I was surprised, because these are very legit, terrific news sources, but I was surprised to hear in the publication that you just mentioned, Jim, and one others, references to the U.S. walking out. There was no walkout, quite the opposite. There was almost 24 hours a day we sat in and worked hard. There was a reference in one of those publications, a very established publication, about the fact that we were not there for the signing ceremony. I can assure you a large number, and our most senior members were there for the signing ceremonies. So the fact that there's misreporting is, we're all big kids, we understand these things happen. But I think what comes through is less the importance of the messaging in terms of how other people report it. It's a very professional group, not only on the U.S. side, but also for other delegations around the world. They understand very well the U.S. views, the importance that the U.S. has to that. And I don't think there was any mistaking where we think things are going in the future. Working very collectively. If you read Terry Kramer, Ambassador Kramer's statement that he made when he announced that we could not sign, it was not belligerent, it was not upset. It was one spoken of explicitly of sadness, of lost opportunities, but how we had sought to work together as we did throughout the entire process, which helps to explain why the document is as good as it is. And I'll say you had 130 people, more or less, coming back pretty exhausted from how interactive and how involved they were in all that. So reporting is one thing, reality often is hopefully the same, but not always.
I am sure all the press stories coming out on this event will be much more accurate. Quick, I think you, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the concerns, again, balkanization of the internet or of telecommunications rules. And so this question probably best for Verizon and AT&T. Are there provisions in the document that you are now subject to in the countries that adopted the treaty, where, say, you're not subject to here because we didn't sign it?
Yeah, thank you. And as a global network service provider, we are already regulated in the countries where we have licenses, and we are currently reviewing now how the new definition of the entities that will be under the ITRs, how that plays into our global business. Some countries already require us to have a license to be operating as an ISP. So we're very cognizant of how it can play out. We're looking into it now, and the regulations don't go into force until 2015. So we do have a little bit of time to further digest completely what the impact may be for our business.
I would just, obviously that analysis that she describes is important to do, but I would also underscore the point I think I and others were making earlier, that if you actually look at a lot of the language, it is hortatory, it's soft language, so we may see countries doing things, many of which they could do anyway, that go in that direction. So at a minimum, we need to take it seriously because it signals a direction, a concern, but it isn't necessarily, hard law. So that's an important point to keep in mind.
I think our very own Brad Jensen may have a question from the floor.
Jonathan, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of your comments. In your initial remarks, you said that the WTO and the ITU were in some sense rivals for jurisdiction in this domain. And in your follow-up question, you said that the U.S. was pursuing this in the TPP and the ISA. I just wondered if you could talk about whether the U.S. will pursue this in the WTO and what the venues for pursuing it there are.
Pursue what?
Protecting the U.S. interests in an open, multi-stakeholder internet?
That's a tough question. There are different institutions, different goals. WTO is enforceable rules. It's done mainly bilaterally. The enforcement and the engagement is generally done bilaterally. The rules are negotiated multilaterally. I'll give one example of where we do see some spillover into the WTO, and where we certainly will actively ensure our interests are protected. This did not come up in this particular conference, but it was a long-standing ITU proposal that some of the developing countries retain the right to have charges for incoming traffic differed based on whether the country was a developing country or a developed country. So essentially, they wanted to use, I think, the ITU framework as a way of saying, I'm going to discriminate, and so that if traffic comes from a developed country, they pay more. If traffic comes from a less developing country, pay less. We would look at that as an MFN issue. We're supposed to be treating countries on a similar basis, and were that to be implemented through rule, we would have the opportunity to challenge it. And that would be the type of issue where discrimination and the trade rules would I think to some extent conflict. Now, that proposal did not, I don't think it went anywhere, right, in the network externality proposal. But that's the type of thing where we would want to make sure there wasn't a conflict. I mean, looking through the document, I'm no expert in ITU law and limited exposures. I don't see a conflict. I don't see this as being something that would, from what they've laid out here, trump anything that we're trying to do. We're trying to promote competition, promote the ability to get into the markets, and essentially let the markets sort out the outcomes. This, to some extent, tips the balance to some extent elsewhere, but it's not hard law, so I don't see the conflict as emerging.
Any other questions from the floor? Seeing none, I guess I would ask our speakers, any other last tidbits you'd like to leave with the audience that you have not yet uncovered? No other pearls of wisdom?
Have a happy holiday.
All right, with that, thank you very much for joining us.